The promise of children is a major theme throughout the Bible and one that is particularly talked about around Christmas. We talked a few days ago about God's promise in Genesis 3 to send a child, to send a son who would destroy sin and death. Today, we see a foreshadowing of that being fulfilled. We actually already saw this promise yesterday in reading God's words to Abraham in Genesis 12. God promised to make Abraham into a great nation and a blessing for the whole world. In Hebrews 11:11-12, we're reminded of the real struggle it is to wait, especially for such a great promise. It was a real struggle for Abraham to believe the promise, but an even harder struggle for his wife Sarah. Let me read these verses for us. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. I've not experienced the pain that Sarah experienced, but I have observed it in others. Sarah was a wife to a man who had power and influence, which you can read about in Genesis 12-14, and yet she was barren. Most cultures value children and childbearing, and the ancient Near East is no exception. And what made it worse was that Sarah knew that God had promised that Abraham would have children, descendants that would outnumber the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Yet she was unable to conceive. She was barren. And God's promises seemed impossible. If you read the story of Abraham and Sarah in Genesis, say from chapter 15 till 21, you'll see their struggle in believing this promise of God. In chapter 15, God again promises Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. Side note, God makes this promise after Abraham complains to him that he is still childless. Then in chapter 16, Sarah has the bright idea that her maidservant, Hagar, could be given in marriage to Abraham, and thus her husband could have a child, sort of adjacent to Sarah. But this is the pattern I mentioned yesterday. Abraham and Sarah had the start of faith. They saw the promises of God and desired to go where God was calling them. They desired that destination, but they wanted desperately to play the role of navigator and choose the best route to get there, forcing their way. Despite this, God was merciful and continued to make this promise, even as Sarah and Abraham grew older and older. In Genesis 17, we again see God's promise to Abraham and Sarah of a son. But what does Abraham do? This is sort of amazing. Genesis 17:17-19 reads, Abraham fell face down, and he laughed, and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might have lived under your blessing. Then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. Abraham is talking with God, getting this great promise, and he laughs at the promises of God. Yet God said that his promise would be kept. And what I find really striking is that God doesn't alter his plan. He doesn't speed it up or slow it down. And God doesn't give up on Abraham, even when Abraham is doubting and laughing at him. God showed mercy and kept his promise. He set the route and called Abraham and Sarah to trust him with that route and with the pace, a far slower pace than they expected or even thought was possible. But Abraham and Sarah did have a son. God gave them Isaac, the long-awaited for son. How are you doing with longing and waiting in your life? We probably don't have something as grand as a theophanous promise of a child, but we all have things that we're hoping for and longing for. We have the rich promises of God, that he loves us, that he forgives us, that he will send his Spirit to help us. This Advent, I'm longing for those things. And we're in a unique time. We're living after Jesus fulfilled many of these promises, but before the fulfillment of the coming of his kingdom, the recreation when Jesus comes again. I long for that as well, and I don't understand why it's taking so long. But God has been faithful. He has kept his promises and will continue to keep them. So as we wait this Advent season, hold on in faith to the promise-keeping God, calling on him for endurance and joy.